menacement activity, I would trust you better. But you obviously have some intention to do something.
We do not. So that's all I can tell you. So we'll get into it when we get into that item on the agenda as well. Any other comment? Okay. Updates on implementation. Who wants to go first? You guys want to fight over that? Cam, you and Dennis. Go ahead.
Okay. Updates for BLM. Right now we are in the process of hiring 4 new positions in our Cheyenne office, including for our management zone lead, as well as state monitoring coordinator, state mitigation coordinator, and GIS specialist. We're also working through there's workload analysis and identifying additional workforce needs in our individual field offices, and that's ongoing. We're going to be having more meetings coming up at the end of this month with our state leadership team. And likewise, we're looking at our training needs and recognizing that there's already been some trainings. We've had several requests for getting additional AIM training for non-BLM folks as well. We are in the process of getting folks trained up on that, doing train the trainer, so that we can increase the number of trainings that we are having so that we can get those out to additional folks, not just BLM. On the policy side, we are still awaiting the national level guidance. That is now supposedly coming out in the next 3 months. I think the policy will then review and determine what additional BLM Wyoming specific policy may be required. Additionally, we are continuously working on some internal stuff regarding our core area version 3, version 4 thing, and that is still awaiting final decision. And hopefully we're going to be getting something this week. We're also looking into possible interim guidance pertaining to winter concentration areas based upon the ongoing efforts of the winter concentration area subgroup. And then finally, continuing to work towards how to incorporate the DDCTs into the national disturbance and reclamation tracking effort that's going on. That is pretty much in a nutshell, I think, the main things that are going on. In the BLM world, we're having continuous dialogue with budget efforts and looking at how to disseminate budget efforts for fiscal year 17. And so we've been submitting information on that stuff, but it's really high level update of where we're at right now.
So let me back you up on the IAMs, because I don't know how familiar everybody is with that process where we've been. The draft IAMs came out in February, and they, as they promised, they shared those with the states at the governor's task force in February. Gave us a chance to review them. I think most of you know we did a fairly intensive review and went back and said these are not going to cut it from our perspective. They took them back in, originally said they were going to try and have them done in April. There were enough, what I would call fatal flaws from the state, not just our state, but other state perspectives, that they pulled them back in and started and went back through using the comments of the state. So for those who are anxious to have the IMs out, don't shoot the messenger, that being the BLM. They are actually responding to the concerns that the states raised, in particular the state of Wyoming. And so I think what we've all said is we'd rather get it right to get it fast, and that's why we have the delay. So that's not all on BLM, nor as the Forest Service when Dennis gets into his they roll out some of their stuff. That's not all on them. It is a unique way of doing it, I know, for the federal government, to actually ask and get comments and have that. Is not normally the way it's done. We appreciate very much their willingness to work with us. And so if you're mad about not getting them out, I think probably it's only fair to say yell at the state, not at the give anything want to add on that. Okay?
Did I second that last statement?
On this one thing. Okay. Any questions for Pam?
Actually, I just want to commend the fact that you all are looking at this with input rather than, you know, firing out what you thought would work and then holding to it for 20 years before we fix it. I think this evolutionary effort is really, really positive, and I commend it.
Okay. Yes.
Primary focus right now is our habitat assessment, bring vegetation inventory to the Department of Ag this week, that what we're doing on the Thunder Basin and the Medicine Bow. And then we've got 2 meetings set up in June, on the June 21st for Department of Ag and BLM field site visit, which is on the protocol and sampling methodology. And then we've got the grazing associations coming in on June 22nd. So that's the primary focus that we're on right now, Bob.
So because everybody has not been involved in all that, you or Joe, Pam, kind of walk people through what the issues are so they understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish.
Well, the record of decision, our record of decision said phase 1 would be the habitat assessment framework. So we'll be conducting 4th order habitat assessment frameworks to determine the condition of the habitat, or is to assess the habitat. And then the second phase of that, or not the second phase, but in conjunction with that, is our vegetation sampling and protocol. In our record of decision, there's 7-inch cover height and 4-inch residual cover. It's in the rod. Once we go out and do the sampling and monitoring, that doesn't mean that the sites have the capability to achieve that. And so the first stop is to get the data, do the assessment. If there's some issues and concerns, then we would roll into the site capability analysis to see if we're looking at Northeast Wyoming primarily, where we have a variety of vegetation conditions naturally occurring, that someplace we just have short grass. And what can these sites actually produce? And so from there, then was working with the grazing association to see if there's any adjustments in grazing that may be needed. Turn on dates, those types of things. But it's a process, and to jump right into adjusting grazing permits is not where we're at. It's the assessment, it's the inventory, then it's the site capability, and then we look at do we need to make some adjustments?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the big thing that we've been focused on is making sure the right things are monitored at the right times and in the right locations. So if you're going to measure what we're screening out for nesting habitat, make sure you're in nesting habitat. I think those guys have been working on getting that figured out. But what constitutes a nest site? Is that 1 foot? Is that 3 feet? Is it 9 feet? Those types of things we're trying to work through with them. And then the reality that whatever you read on paper is not going to be the same thing as actually in the field. That's why the 21st is going to be a big deal. To get out there and put some of these things off the ground. You can read the habitat assessment framework, or whatever you want to read 1,000 times, and then say, it's just not going to be.
We've got, the initial assessments done with maps and aerial photography, and are we within 5.3 miles of the lake? Are there disturbances? Does it meet the criteria for nesting habitat? And then we've also got field-based rejection criteria that when you're on the ground, it may not look quite like it did in the aerial photography. And what are those rejections? So that we have a consistent sampling protocol that's measuring the appropriate, what we're looking for.
Yeah, just to give an example for those who haven't been immersed in this. The process I think that we're at now, you take your aerial photography, see if it meets the EO So your 5% becomes a threshold. Then the nesting criteria are 15 to 25. One of the things we found in meeting with the agencies here a couple of weeks ago is their veg layers don't do 15, they do 10 or 20. So you got to use 10, and then when you get into that 10, you have to adjust for the better nesting habitat. Those are the kind of things that have to happen in the field, like going Dennis was saying. And so each of those steps takes a little bit of time, and then that has to go back into the instruction manuals and the methodologies. But again, we'd rather get it right than get it fast. And so we've had numerous meetings and discussions about that. I do want to thank Tom Christensen, Matt Holland, and some of the others for really helping us get focused on where and how to do some of these metrics, because it's important that we do the thing that's right for the species. That's what we're doing. We're not doing it for sagebrush. We're doing it for sage grouse. Yeah, they live it, but we need to get to where we're looking at the right things in the right places. So, anything else on you guys as far as you want to let them know about Dan? All that, that's probably.
Oh, it's just information. There's been some changes in the Forest Service here in the last couple of days. Dan Barone was the regional forester out of Denver, Style, Wyoming, Colorado, South Dakota, and Kansas. Has now accepted or has gone to DC. He's the associate chief of the #2 person in the Forest Service right now. It's technically an acting assignment, but he doesn't have a return ticket right now, so we're not sure. So we'll take that what it means. So in the meantime, has assumed the role of regional forester. Jackie's very familiar with the state of Wyoming. She was the forest supervisor on the Bridger Teton prior to going to Denver. So she's going to assume the role as the acting regional forester, and then Jim Bedwell is filling her job as the deputy regional forester and resources. So my standpoint, Dan has been on Medicine Bow and Thunder Basin. Came up with Deputy Chief Leslie Walden and actually saw 6 sage grouse hens scooting around. So they're very familiar with the area. Jackie's very familiar with Wyoming and where we are with sage grouse. She was instrumental in helping with the rod and records of decision. So we have good, knowledgeable people in the right places, is I guess my perspective right now, that are familiar with Wyoming, familiar with sage grouse, and where we're headed.
Any questions for Dennis? Yeah.
Maybe both Dennis and Pam. Right now, there's a lot of these studies are getting mushed together, like we're doing AIM, but there's a lot of inconsistency across field offices. People don't know what they're supposed to be doing, when they're supposed to be. They're being driven by rangeland health assessments and habitat assessments. All this stuff's getting mushed into a big, people don't know what they have to do, when they have to do it, or how they have to do it. And so the permittees that are involved in their permit renewal processes or veg studies, we're kind of, there's a lot of people out there that are saying, well, you have to do this, you have to do that. Well, we're not sure, we're waiting for guidance. So I guess a word of, I agree with you, we don't want to do it wrong, but business has to continue. And when you're pulled in a lot of different directions, either unnecessarily or unknowingly, it makes it very difficult to do business.
So I'm actually going to let both Dennis and Pam off the hook a little bit, because the point for us have been Jessica Crowder and Joe on these. And I know they had a meeting again yesterday or the day before on that. So do you want to update people where we are with that, where that's headed?
I guess the meeting yesterday that I had, Doug, was we were hearing some stuff as far as AIM and HAP, and whether or not they're going to use one or the other or a combination. What Jessica and I have tried to focus on is making sure that AIM protocols or the AIM strategy, the habitat assessment framework, standards for healthy rangeland, all those types of things stay in their respective bins until it's time for one to inform the other, or vice versa. So strategy, half is your methodology. Nothing is changing with the standards. They're not changing any of that stuff. Okay, correct me if I'm wrong. Those things are still going to be the same. So what would change in my mind, and I don't know if there is any guidance yet, but the way that I picture it is that you're going to go through standards and everything like you would for a normal permit renewal. And then on the other side, you're going to run your habitat assessment framework. That habitat assessment framework will then inform the NEPA process for your renewal for sage grouse on that particular portion of that document. The app doesn't provide standards. It doesn't provide a pass and fail for your standards. It just informs standard 4, which is your wildlife standard. And even within that standard, if you say you failed based on percent of safety or something like that, that doesn't mean that you failed the entire standard. So failure of proportion doesn't mean failure of the entire thing. That it has to stay specific to safety. So the app can't overrule standards and the AIM strategy. There's portions of the app that will feed into AIM. AIM can feed data back and forth between the app, but they all stay separate until they have to talk to each other. So I think that's part of the struggle right now. Is there's nothing that says when you bring them together, when you keep them separate.
And one of the other problems, we had our grazing board meeting Monday, and the site capability and the ESDs, there is an effort to try and get some of those done up in the, on Beaver Rim, you know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
They've got some done for one soil type. And then I appreciate the comment about soil, capability, because right now that's kind of a low priority thing. It's a big thing if you're out there. It's like we have to produce this. We don't do that on the best of year. So I guess right now we're trying to learn how to do it right. That's fine.
So I think one of the things, Doug, that's really hard about this to me is that the logic that you would have would say you do the capability piece first and then you work up from that. That's just not where we are. We're actually doing it backwards. We're saying, where are we? And then working back to what's the capability. And it's not wrong to do it that way. It's a little counterintuitive that the half is kind of driving this. So we're looking at what's out there. Then you have to factor that into what kind of years you have. And then you factor that backwards into what your capability is. And at the end of the day, one of the real frustrations we're all going to have to learn to share is that that's 1 year. So we don't have a trend. We don't have a baseline. We have 1 year. And let's just be honest and understand that and continue to use it as a learning curve. As Dennis said, nobody's going to run out there and adjust a permit based on this year end. Right? We're trying to figure out what do we have, and we need to hold everybody to that. So, but it's backwards to me. And I think that's probably true to most permittees.
So they're doing this in land or field office?
What's that?
They're doing most of this in land or field office that you're seeing?
Well, there's a lot of permit renewal activity going on.
So why is Lander so worried about the habitat assessment framework if they're not denying it?
I don't think they're worried about it. It's just, it's like, we have to do A. Okay. Well, there's concerns whether A is adequate, and provides a general baseline, but when you get down to tinkering with permits and stuff, it's not adequate. So
this is part of the conversation I had with BLM yesterday. AIM is a strategy, and there are some site-specific indicators in AIM, but overall, it's a strategy. So half is a bunch of methodology. AIM is not going to tell you much of anything except for this looks okay or this doesn't look okay at a pretty broad or coarse scale. Usually, it's better for permitting. Stop trying to make it do what it's not supposed to do. That would be. You want to look at the permit in that law, look at that law, that data can be into any, that's fine. For your overall land use development. But you're not going to put one aim point in the law and say, we're done. So Green Mountain, we did aim on that one. There's 14 points on that law. That's maybe 60,000.
I got 15 big pastures. So.
Yeah.
No, we just need to be aware of what's going on out there. I don't think we're this assessment is, all clarified yet. So it's, maybe we're doing it backwards, but everybody needs to recognize that and not start making, drop dead decisions.
Yeah, and I think we all need to be diligent. I've had conversations with BLM and Forest Service range people in the last 2 weeks, and depending a whole lot on how long you've been there, how much experience you have, what you read on the paper or what you get in the training is very different. So some of the long-term people who have dealt with this since the beginning take it a little differently than somebody who's a new tech. And that's, I think, where the real challenge is. That's why Dennis is doing what he's doing on the basis, to get everybody out there to where you get a Bob Mountain who's been there 30 years and say, this is what you should be looking at. And the guy that's been there 30 days can learn. But it's going to be bumpy. Hell, we know that. But I think as long as we all kind of get engaged, the one part of this that I think could really be a failing, and that we've hammered on the agencies hard, is if the permittees do not get adequate notice and are not adequately involved in this, it will fail. Because they need to be there and understand what's going on, and the agencies need their length of time on the land, their wisdom, their knowledge of that place to make it work. So that's just a critical. Anything else for the BLM Forest Service? Yes.
In the absence of the IMs, how's BLM dealing with oil and gas permits, especially if they're informed?
I'm actually going to defer to Michael Madrid for this question.
Well, we haven't changed anything. We're still working them on a first come, first served basis. I don't know if that was your question. Haven't changed, official change.
From the standpoint of what you're asking the project proponents to do to process the permits.
One of the things I think there seems to be some confusion at the highest levels, surprise, surprise, over the difference between a process and a prioritization. We're still trying to get some understanding that if Wyoming has a process to evaluate lease applications, that will give you a prioritization. You can't just throw it on a piece of paper and say, this is our priority, because you don't know what the hell you're evaluating. And I think at the DC level, they view it as, we'll just prioritize and say, do this. That isn't going to work. Wyoming has a good process. They're working on retooling that still, aren't you, Michael? Yeah. And that's maybe the two of you can get together. But that's what we would like to see. And Jeremiah is the one who's been doing most of the work on this, so you may want to glad you went. Okay. Anything else? BLM Forest Service. If you're behind me, just holler because I can't see you in the back. Oh, come on. My wife can. Out of that, hurry. Well, she can see through mine. Okay. Now, you open your mouth and return, Tyler. You have that one.
I'll make a few points here, and then I'll let you fill in the gaps. So our regional leadership is still in the process of restructuring our sagebrush ecosystem branch that will include sage grouse and other sagebrush operatives, and that is a process in the works that I think I'll ask Pat to speak a little bit more on later if she has any more clarification for some of that. We also have preliminary approval for a sagebrush ecosystem, sage grouse leadership position in our Wyoming field office. It's been approved with leadership and HR, so that's going through the process right now. And this person really will be, I think, a big help in terms of facilitating implementation of BLM and Forest Service plans and being sort of a liaison among the other states range-wide. Looking right now to finalize the data collection framework for the CTD Conservation Effects Database that I know everybody's waiting to hear about. And we are really requesting leadership to provide that fund review and get that back to us so that we can kick it out to the states and the folks like Dennis's folks on the ground that are collecting data as we speak. We realize the urgency in getting that done, and we're trying very hard to push as much as we can to get that out. We do have I guess you can call it a range-wide mitigation team working to clarify some mitigation terminology, for example, additionality, and really to think about what does that conservation benefit mean, when do we achieve it, how do we demonstrate the achievement of that, and you know, in particular in the context of some of these large projects like the interstate transmission lines, which we've been working on for several years. I think getting some clarity there so that we can get some, maintain some continuity in terms of the way we deal with these projects range-wide, but also provide some assurance to the developers that, you know, there is a clear answer on this and that we can make some decisions and move forward and just kind of close the loop, that it's not going to be this open-ended planning process. And to that point, our technical advisory group for Energy Gateway South, Gateway West, and Trans-West Express is, I would say, in the finalization process of coming to agreement on what direct effects and indirect effects analysis look like. And that's been a major struggle, I think, as some folks are aware, but we're getting there. And I think we're getting there in a way that, you know, everybody feels like from the state perspective and from the federal perspective and from the project component perspective, it's a little bit of a compromise. It's a little bit of, you know, the science isn't super clear on it, but we're all sort of accepting, you know, finding that point of flexibility and coming to agreement on that. So I think we'll wrap that up in the next month. Those are the big things going on right now in the Wyoming Field Office. And Pat, if you can provide any more clarity in terms of our safe flourish ecosystem regional structure.
I can provide information, but nothing provides clarity. That's probably a different question. So the service has recognized leadership for single species in situations of ecosystem, which actually identified in the Endangered Species Act. And so they focus very hard on looking at safe fresh ecosystem office concept. They're not creating a new office, they're trying to find a structure within the agency that's going to be effective in getting conservation on the ground, helping our partners in conservation on the ground, because we have no management authority over this bird. We don't manage a whole lot of habitat outside of our refuge. And so the latest proposal, and it's still very rough at this point, is each field office has gotten together with what we call the project leaders and supervisors of programs. So in Wyoming, it was talking to the supervisors of our refuges, talking to our Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program supervisor, Tyler, wanted to bring in our management assistance office, which is our liaison with the tribes. Who else is that?
The second, up in the Jackson.
Yeah, Steve Allen of the National Wildlife Refuge. We're going to try to bring in the Arapahoe Refuge Manager because they manage the properties like a Pathfinder and Mortensen. The idea is the state wants to identify what we can do to better affect conservation and safe fresh ecosystems. And once those key elements are identified, wrapped up range-wide, and that basically becomes our structure. What is it that we can do on the ground, that we can help get the conservation on the ground, and allow that to happen versus having a top-down type structure. For example, our Partners for Fish and Wildlife Program, Mark Hogan, said he really didn't need more staff and he needed more money to get projects on the ground with conservation done. So those are the kind of things we're trying to identify and try to provide them the support they need. Along with that, we are going to have some what we call oversight teams. And this is just the proposal right now, and not for once. So talk to you next month. For next meeting. The one that I'm going to share is our science oversight team. And it's programmatic. It is basically identifying what our needs are, what's happening out there, how to make sure we're doing communication amongst all of our divisions internally, amongst all of our field officers, across all of our regions. We have gotten a proposal for that. It's been tentatively approved, but it still needs to somehow, we need to make sure that we're supporting our field officers. Another one will be a mitigation team, because the whole mitigation question is definitely a hot topic across the entire range of the species, plus we have a new mitigation policy, right, national non-species specific policy that's going to be coming out soon. We want to make sure we've got that consistency and we're working well together. And probably the basins, continue to just help address the Great Basin, that overarching issue of safer ecosystem. Beyond that, I don't have any information about the proposed structure. We currently have 2 state fresh ecosystem conservation coordinators. We're not sure what their role will be, if their role will continue. That all has to be worked out. But preliminarily, I mean, the whole intent is to put it on the ground and then provide the field to give the resources to make that happen. So it's probably way more detail than you wanted. I'm hoping that we will have that finalized, because on call this morning, and I'm hoping we'll really have that finalized within the next month or 2. So that you folks will have an idea of who you need to be working with. It won't change in Wyoming. Ecological services will continue to be a point of contact. And if you need to have other needs to partner with them, because I'm sure that needs to get into me. So, however, I will probably be leaving the decision to assume this new position as soon as everything's approved. I'll come back to this. I'll come back to Temple. So
I think that there's a order that directs you to the team.
I have a card.
Yeah, exactly.
It's laminated and everything.
Unless you want to find the governor.
But this is an anti-heckling.
I know. And the other thing I want folks to know, last week, and just, rumor control, I don't want folks misunderstanding what happened, but last week I attended a meeting at the United on the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Fish and Wildlife Service secured some funding to help WAFLA initiate what we're calling the Science Initiative. And it's to identify gaps in our understanding of safer species. And there was a small meeting last week, kind of planning group that got together. It involved, there were some federal folks there, our LCCs were there, BLM was there, Forest Service was there. But most importantly, we had state folks there and a lot of NGOs. And because WAFLA helps with the meeting, that could happen. It was basically saying where are information gaps and how do we get those closed. So that effort is called the WAFLA Science Initiative. It's got some seed funding from Fish and Wildlife Services are making that happen. Incredibly enthusiastic folks working on that. We had a couple of folks at the University of Wyoming who attended. Identified what we're calling focal species, try to identify the gap. And so it goes way beyond sage grouse, but part of what we're asking is that science initiative is how does management for sage grouse potentially affect some of these other focal species. We all know that if you're managing for pygmy rabbits, you probably should do that the same way you're managing for sage grouse, because pygmy rabbits are not going to be successful in that situation. So we're trying to identify the gaps. We're trying to look at how we're managing down for sage grouse and identify perhaps areas outside of what we're managing for sage grouse. There are things that should be done for other species or to conserve other unique habitats. It's not a regulatory document at all. It's simply identifying gaps. There'll be RFPs that will go out later to identify or to help close those gaps. And from that, there will be a strategy, again, a non-regulatory strategy, basically saying these are the things that we need to do to support safer ecosystem conservation. It's going to take a format identical or similar to what 2006 sage grouse conservation strategy that was interagency. So if you get rumors on that, please bring them to me. I'll help dispel them or convert them. That was appropriate. But it really is intended to be a large stakeholder agency group effort to form a strategy moving forward. We just kept the group small, or WAFLA kept the group small last week. Your initial meetings can get pretty crazy if your group's too big. But it's a pretty exciting, very exciting.
Okay, any questions for Fish?
Question of, when you were talking about the mitigation, Tyler, so even though that process is going to be finalized soon, if there is new science that comes out, particularly with, it's going to be years before these projects actually happen, is there a process to get that in, or kind of once it's closed and that's it?
Well, I guess in terms of flexibility, that's there's a lot of, I guess, laying out the sideboards of basic process and principles in terms of what the mitigation should look like and how we should go about doing that. On one hand, for direct effects, they're using the habitat frequency analysis for the transmission lines, and that's pretty straightforward. One-to-one mitigation for sagebrush ecosystem, sagebrush obligates, and then in Wyoming, there won't be any mitigation recognizing that they're following 4-area strategy, and that is the mitigation. So for the other states, there's some flexibility there in terms of as the biology. We learn more, we need to make some adjustments on the ground. If you're talking about our buffers a little bit different, our activities that need to be avoided in proximity to lakes, that kind of thing. There's a lot of flexibility in there, I think. And that, I think, was one of the challenges right now, was given a lot of the unknowns and giving the state of the science some disagreement in terms of, will you err on the side of being conservative, do you err on the side of being a little bit more liberal for the project opponents? Finding that spot right now where we all agree, this is approximately where we would like to see it go. It probably will shift over the years. So I would say the short answer is, yeah, there is that flexibility in there. It's definitely not a set in stone process, other than when for the states that don't have 4-area strategy, like Colorado and Utah, for example, they are using the KIA for mitigating direct effects. So that's a modeling effort. It's a quantifiable model. It will be done, and I think that we would like to kind of close that loop and with that process in terms of evaluating potential indirect effects and ongoing research and activities. I think that's probably a place where there's going to be, keep our eye on the science and have to maintain some flexibility within given sideboards. So we have sagegrass technical experts, whether it's Pat Diver or Lee Whitman or Heather McFerrin, working with BLM experts and working with consultants who really understand that literature well, coming together in agreement that as that science moves forward, here's where we think we need to move. So I think we have a good process set up for that. I think there's that flexibility there. That answers your question.
Other question? Okay. Anybody, Brian, do you have anything you want to add?
Not really for implementation planning. Business as usual, I guess, for us.
Okay, good enough. Mike?
This is Mark, if I stand up there.
Yeah, it should work from right there.
I might stand up there just so I can point some stuff.
Which one do you want?
Sure.
I have no idea where the lights are. Is that them?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, I'm off.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm Mike Curran. I'm a PhD student at UW. Pete Stahl, the director of the Wyoming Reclamation and Restoration Center, is my advisor. Before I get going, I just want to thank the WRC support sponsors, BP, Chesapeake, Shell, and Conoco Phillips. I should also thank Anadarko for being really helpful with this mitigation opportunity mapping tool, which I'll talk about today. I'm going to discuss the WRC reclamation database, the merger between the WRC database and the DEC key, which should be done hopefully next week. We were calling out the mitigation opportunity mapping, the MOM tool. I'm going to discuss some of the issues we have with current criteria for reclamation success, the logic behind the approach that we're taking, suggestions for using ecological site descriptions, where we're hoping to go in the future, and then I do have some supplemental slides on monitoring if I have time or if questions arise about them. I'll ask Mary to bring them up now. Just to get going, touch a little bit on what Pat was just talking about. This white area is the state of Wyoming. Everything in red is what this is from WIN, the Wyoming Natural is just a sage grouse occupancy map. All these points are wells from the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So when we started this WRC database, we were pretty much an aspatial database where we were looking at points, not actual polygons. I'm going to get into that. I'm going to just say from this slide, I'm going to go forward. This is the same map with this green area as what's identified as core. While we do have some issues with regulatory criteria, success criteria, I do want to point out there is quite a bit of oil and gas development in the state that's not in sage grouse habitat. So, for example, over in the Cheyenne area, like Pat was kind of alluding to, there's really no reason, in my opinion, to be monitoring for the to be sage grouse habitat. We're asking it to be reclaimed towards sage grouse habitat. It never was. If things like penguin rabbits and other animals are over there, there's occupancy maps for all of them that can be more species specific. This is a little redundant for anyone that was at the last digit, but I'm going to go through it. Just a timeline of our database. In 2011, this was initiated between the WRC and BP. We were taking in data from the long side of the Jonah and the last part. This was what my master's work was on. 2012, we presented at the PAW Reclamation Conference in December. In 2013, in February, Pat numbers from again low approached us to see if we could kind of beat this database up. So with the help of Esther Wagner and PAW, Dave Brown, and Gary Austin, and others. Well, we contacted all the PAW operating members. We published our framework in 2013. In 2013, we also started collecting data from other operators. Currently, we're working with 21 companies. It's a little hard to keep track of this as companies are selling. Some companies are moving out of the state. We're taking in data from the newer companies. So that number is somewhat in flux. In 2014, we summarized and organized data for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Data Call. As of January 2015, I was able to create polygons for 30,592 acres of disturbance. Of that, about 80% was in the process of being reclaimed or finished with reclamation. We were acknowledged by the Fish and Wildlife Service in July for our efforts. And in the middle of last year, we began the mitigation opportunity mapping tool with WIGIS in the Wyoming National Diversity Database. This tool, we took every lek in the state, put a 2-mile buffer around it. So we have, by June 30th, we'll have over 2,400 individual maps. I'll get into that a little bit. I know as of right now, I just finished a couple days ago with all of my data. I'm going to be sitting down with Jacqueline Alexander, who's our technician in Nicholas, on Friday, to transfer that to them. And then next week, we're going to be working out some of the keys that we've been having in our databases. So we got 2016, the MOM tool will be complete. We're hopeful to continue with funding towards the tool formerly known as MOM. This is a lek-based disturbance, disruption, reclamation, and restoration tracking and optimization tool. We're going to come up with a better acronym for that sometime. Hopefully pretty soon.
That's good. No, it's not short enough.
I'll give you some help on that.
So this is just kind of the conceptual framework of the WRC database. This is actually June 2nd. We got notice that this went to print, so hopefully this week or next week, I'll have copies of this publication available from the Journal of Environmental Solutions for Oil, Gas, and Mining. Essentially, what we're doing for oil and gas, this master table here, we're taking the API number for the initial well on the well pad, or if it's not a multi-well pad, just the API number. We're linking to that reclamation practices, so we're tracking seed mixes, soil amendments, fertilizers, herbicide treatments. Where it's a little harder to track things like snow fencing and stuff that's in a very specific spatial location on well pads, but we'll hopefully be able to do that. We've linked environmental variables, so we've got soil tables where they're available. A climate table, we're using the DAMET database from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And then response. This is vegetation monitoring. So our argument is that reclamation practices plus environmental variables are going to lead to a vegetation response. Our vegetation response is going to tell us if we're meeting regulatory criteria or not. If we're not meeting them, we have to go back through the cycle and do some more reclamation work. This is an incomplete map. We actually have all the Jonah, so a lot of you guys have seen this before. Nicholas and Jacqueline just asked me to wait until I have all my data in until I submit more. This was just sort of a mock-up. What I want to point out here is this dashboard on the reclamation. We have no data, pre-monitoring, unsuccessful, natives present, meets rollover criteria, meets SGEO. This is up in the Jonah, so this lek here is on federal land. We're separating leks between federal, tribal, private, and state. All of this disturbance around the area is oil and gas. Most of this is an interim reclamation. Jonah, I'm going to get to this in a minute, but Jonah has the strictest regulatory criteria in the state. A lot of these sites that you see in this bright green where it's meeting the sage-grouse executive order are actually not meeting the rollover. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit more. If I show maps from other fields, we'll see sites that are meeting rollover that are not meeting the sage-grouse executive order criteria. And we'll learn about that a little bit more. Yeah, the reason why I only have 6 things on this dashboard is because this map is getting pretty convoluted already. But this was sort of the logic. This comes from the project management literature. But more or less, status unaddressed or recorded is what we're calling no data. So it means we were able to map it on the ground. We just don't have any data whatsoever. Meeting expectations are on course. That would be the natives present category. In the future, I'd like to break that unsuccessful up into some improvements needed now, where there's critical issues going on, and I'm going to explain this dashboard. Exceeding expectations or completed would be that it's meeting the SGEO, and then somewhere in between here is what's meeting rollover. So our dashboard explanation, no data, means we drew the map on the most recent aerial imagery. We just don't have any data about it. Pre-monitoring means we've received seed mix, herbicide treatments, or some other form of reclamation practice information. We just don't have any quantitative monitoring data associated with it, so we know the process is in place. We just don't know how it's doing. Unsuccessful, this could mean a site has an abundance of noxious weeds, or is mostly bare ground. Natives present means it's not meeting regulatory criteria, and it's not meeting the SGEO, but the monitoring data shows it's on the right path. In many cases, I have data going back through 2005. In other cases, where it's pre-monitoring, we're working with the operators to set up a monitoring system. And that's something we hope to do in the future with this POM tool as it goes forward. As it is now, it's just static with lek counts and what the reclamation status is today. In the future, we'd like to go back in the past so people can go on the web and figure out in 2009 what was those well paths, or what were those well paths looking like. Meets regulatory criteria. That means it's meeting the BLM rollover, or up on South State land, it's meeting the stormwater pollution prevention plan. And I'm going to get into these a little bit more detail in the next slide or two. But it's not meeting this SGEO. Then meeting SGEO means that it's meeting the executive order criteria, regardless of if it's meeting the regulatory criteria or not. I want to go into the SGEO, what I've highlighted here in red. The site, a reclaimed site, can be considered suitable habitat if it contains at least 2 native grasses, one of them being bunch grass, 2 native forbs. At no point within the grass forb habitat is more than 60 meters from adjacent 5% sagebrush cover. And I'm going to go back to this Jonah map actually. So some of these sites here where it's meeting SGEO, the reference site has more than 5% sagebrush on it. The site has at least 2 forbs, at least 2 grasses, one of which is bunch grass. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's that kind of sagebrush on the site. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's meeting JIO criteria. Get into that a bit more. Just going through to get to some of the logic behind this is where we're really coming in through the policy for evaluating conservation efforts is there a certainty that the conservation effort would be effective? There's 5 questions here. Is the issue being addressed? Really, what I'm interested in is their quantifiable data. And then I didn't highlight this principles for adaptive management. I can get into that in the questions or if I have some more time, but one of the issues that we're having now is I'm just accepting data from all the operators and whatever form they're taking it, transforming it into our database. And like I said, I'm just finishing 2015 data within the last week or so. It's, to me, not really adaptive management. It's taking such a long time. I do have some ideas about how to address that a little bit better. Just to go through the flow chart of the CED, one of the things I asked for reclamation is, has effort been implemented? Yes, that's all the stuff I'm tracking. I can say, yes, there's an effort implemented. If I don't have quantifiable monitoring data, I can't say with any confidence that it's an effective effort. Oftentimes, it's too early to tell. A lot of these sites are still in the process of being reclaimed or restored. And in some cases, you can say, yes, it's effective. This is just a table I've made of different BLM field office criteria and state criteria for reclamation success. Some of these have changed. The Jonah and the Pinedale required species for richness indicators for forests, shrubs, and grasses. So I can go through those databases and easily answer the SGEO. Kemmer or Sgit is, as of their 2007 EIS, it reads that a site needs greater than or equal to 80% ground cover of the reference site, no erosion features, and less than 10% of the vegetation covered with noxious weeds. In 2015, in September, they released an RFP. I need to talk to the BLM a little bit more to make sure I'm not misinterpreting anything. But they state in there that the operators work with the BLM on developing a plan for success. The operators, which I've talked to, and the monitoring reports that I'm seeing from 2015 seem to still be going on that 2007 EIS. In other areas where they've updated, they're saying ESTs will be selected, and I'm going to get into that in a few slides. We need to develop our ESTs a little bit better throughout the state. I'm just going to go through one example for Wamsutter. This is what's required by the BLM. We're tracking here if it's private, state, or on federal land, but we're giving me relative foliar cover and grass cover, floor foliar cover, shrub foliar cover, and weed foliar cover. So with this data, I can answer if it's meeting rollover criteria. I can answer if it's in the native present category or if it's a failure. I can't actually go on to say if it's meeting the GEO because we don't have that filtration criteria. We are working with this specific operator and have provided a few columns to them that will allow us to answer those questions after their 2016 monitoring report. And that's sort of the approach that I'm hoping to take, is to provide the operators with the columns that we need to be able to answer these questions, whether or not that meets the regular, or that's what the regulatory agencies are asking. And so far, we seem to be having a very good response from the operators. In several areas where we are in that pre-monitoring category, we've gone out, and the Madden field, for example, I've gone out and seen some of the best reclamation I've seen in the state. That's all in pre-monitoring. So Pete and I will be going out with the operators in that area, hopefully at the end of June or the beginning of July, giving them a template that they can fill out. This is a little hard to read, but in the Jonah, we have a bunch more columns where we have forest richness, shrub richness, all the things we need to answer the SGO or the SGO criteria, and then some. I do want to point out in their regulatory criteria, it says forest richness on site needs to be equal to or greater than a reference. This column, I know this is hard to read. The reference for forms is right here. You'll see For example, this reference site had 10 forbs. This forb on the reclaimed site is 3. So that technically can meet the Sage Grouse executive order criteria. It's not meeting the JIO criteria. So it's where you see those bright greens in that Jonah map I showed you before. And yeah, just in concluding about the regulatory criteria, I'll say not all regulatory criteria are set up to meet the executive order criteria. Some regulatory criteria are going above and beyond meeting the executive order. When we get into private lands, it's a little bit tricky. Some operators are just tracking private lands the same way that they're tracking federal lands. Other times it depends on who the private landowner is. And sometimes we just don't have the data. It's in the pre-monitoring category. I would argue that we need to have more consistency. And as I said, the WRC is working with operators to add columns and data we need to answer questions being asked. This is something, if we can keep this tool formerly known as BOM alive, we hope to just provide templates to the operators. One thing that will help us tremendously with the time is having it all be spatially explicit. What I have to do now when you see a report like Guam Center, I have to go through the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and link up every one of those sites and fill that on, feed them in. Nicholas, the crew up in Y just use running scripts to actually link those dots to the polygons that you see there to give them specific color codes. So it's something that we hope to continue working on. Moving forward, we are hoping to incorporate finer scale data from individual projects. I'll give an example of this. Defining success criteria, I'll talk about ecological site descriptions here, where we're at with incorporating data from other industries, and then a little bit about private lands. Yeah, when we talk about incorporating finer scale data, this is on a private lek. It's the East Antelope lek. You can see this is a burn area. This next map I'm going to show you is a project that the Douglas Warrior team's working on. Pete is part of that. Casey Balthrop is studying his master's thesis, I think, in the next week or two, and Amy Jacobs is the master's student that's taking this project on. The outline in purple on this next map is just an outline of this burn. You can see they planted, I think, over 18,000 sagebrush in all these little plots here. There's good evidence to suggest that the sage grouse are actually using these areas. As we move forward, this is something that we're going to be hopefully incorporating into these tools. Some of these fine scale individual projects that are happening on sort of the subgroup or the core area teams. And yeah, just to go back to this map where we're tracking leks on the bottom, over time you can see after that bird, these birds are actually starting to respond. I'm going to be interested to see what's happening in 2016 and 2017 as we get more and more sagebrush established in that area. Yeah, moving forward, where I said that map of these 11 by 17-inch papers are getting a little convoluted. Our goal is eventually to have 4 maps for each lek, so we can really show a lot more information, a lot clearer. What I'm interested in is land cover and reclamation efforts. I'd like to make my dashboard system out into more like 9 or 10 categories rather than 5 or 6 that I'm applying to now. And yeah, this is just sort of an example of where we eventually hope to go with the tool. From here, I'm going to move on to ESDs. This is just a poster Pete and I presented at the SRM meetings back in Laramie in October, November of last year. This is a soil map up in the Jonah. You can see each one of these dots represents a well pad. This is hard to read, but here I just showed soil map unit 5203 where we have 53 individual well pads. I'm looking at the reference areas. In this specific case, I'm showing forb richness. We have a range of 1 to 7 forbs. Our mean forb richness is just over 3. Well, see sites in Jonah that have 6 forbs on them that are considered failures to the JIO because the reference site might have 7. You go half a mile down the road and see a site with 4 forbs or 1 forb on it might be successful because it's referenced at 1. I would argue if we're going to use ESDs, we can take a mean of our reference transects in that and all of these 53 sites should be aiming for 3 forbs rather than some need 7, some need 1. I think that would help clarify to the operators and to the regulatory agencies that these groups of sites are all aiming towards a common goal rather than we have a specific goal for every single individual site within a map unit. We're going to show, this is just a 50 centimeter resolution image from Jonah. I purchased this from some funding from the WWNRT, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing with that. One of the things we're doing, this is the soil map unit when we get in here. Sorry to anyone that's red and green colorblind, I know these are really messy maps, but I'm just taking these and running cluster algorithms on my computer, and you can see in the Jonah, we're actually getting pretty close. What our high resolution aerial imagery is showing us is actually not too far off of what our soil maps are showing us. A problem that we have with this though, this is just Carbon and Sweetwater County, our soil maps. We're missing our soil maps and ESDs in a lot of areas. One of the images we got from the ones that are here is we don't have any soil maps of that. So I'm gonna say that our ESDs are not well developed. In a lot of cases, our soil maps aren't well developed. I will say, if we do have operators out collecting data anyway, it seems logical to me that we can use this data on the reference sites to expedite the process of mapping vegetations and hopefully speed up the process of developing ESDs. I've been in discussions with Brian Christensen about this and hope to meet up with him in Pinedale in the next couple of weeks to figure out exactly what they need us or what they need the operators to check in. But I do think that that's something that'd be helpful for everybody. If we've already got this large repository, why not use it to help the BLM and Forest Service and NRCS towards their mission of using ESDs. Also, I do believe high quality aerial imagery can help expedite this process. We do need to go on the ground with it. But as you can see from that slide before, we're not too far off, and we're using our algorithms on the computer to kind of make soil maps for us. Some questions with ESDs are, should we be aiming at the climax for restoration success, or should we just getting back to a state within the state transition model suitable? I would argue that a site is in an area that's not, the reference isn't in climax, just getting it back kick-started into that state transition model is probably a good start. I'm going to just show a little bit of some research Pete and I are currently working on. One of the question I have here is, do earlier successional stages have benefits to reclamation and ecosystem services? One of the critiques of ecological restoration is we're often focused on the end goal, it's meeting regulatory criteria, and we forget about what's happening during the processes. I do have a pretty strong belief that we have quantitative data to show this, that having some of these early successional stages can have very significant benefits to ecosystems. The specific example I'm going to use is in the Pinedale. This is the edge of a well pad that was seeded with Rocky Mountain bee plant. I just took a group of sites with Rocky Mountain bee plant on them, a group of sites that only had grasses on them, and was collecting insects. I've been doing this for the last 2 summers. This paper is actually being presented at the ASMR meeting in Spokane right now. Pete's up there doing it for me, but it's called Insect Response to Reclaimed Well Pads with Different Vegetation Characteristics in a Semi-Arid Natural Gas Field. And we do see on these reclaimed sites with Rocky Mountain bee plant that average over 125 insects on them compared to the reference sites in the kind of the decade-old sagebrush communities. We have an average somewhere about 40. It makes sense. This is not something that's been studied in non-agriculture systems, but the theory from agriculture align pretty much perfectly. Again, in these grass reclaimed sites, we're seeing over 50 insects on average compared to under 20 on the reference. What I'm actually really the most interested in is looking at the reference areas. And these are all in the same ESDs, kind of just a decadent sagebrush depth reference system. We're seeing significantly higher amounts of insects on a reference areas adjacent to our paths with forbs on them than our paths without forbs. So that's a question that we hope to answer is, can we have actually sort of these fringe benefits when we have these early successional ecosystem processes going? The same thing goes for richness systems. Sort of more or less the same results that we saw earlier. So that's something where I will agree with in that executive order. We do have our forbs and our grasses on sites near sagebrush communities. I do think there's a good argument that we don't need to always be aiming at having great sagebrush cover on those reclaimed well paths. Where we are with other industries, we've begun our discussions with coal. We have acquired all the information from Decker and Spring Creek surface coal mines near Sheridan, Wyoming. The data we received, the quality of it's pretty good. The problem with it, it's not spatial. What they're doing on these coal mines is breaking sites up into just blocks and monitoring within them. We aren't able to map out where the actual blocks within the coal mines are, so it's pretty difficult for us to put on the map at this point. So that's something that Pete and I will be continuing to discuss with that industry. I know Pete has contacts with the Bentonite and drone industries. I haven't really gotten to talking to them all that much yet. As I alluded to before, some of the areas where we don't have a lot of great information is on private lands. I think we need some outreach to help this. We've talked to Nels Hansen at the Stock Growers Association meeting last week. Was just speaking with Dirk Scosta and one of his grad students, Sgit Am, who are working on this exact issue about sage-grouse habitat on private lands. I spoke with Brian just briefly at the last DCA meeting. I'm not sure if there's a way to incentivize private landowners to reclaim their sites to sage-grouse habitat or wildlife habitat instead of domestic livestock habitat. That's definitely a discussion I think we could go into a little bit further. Incorporating separate studies, the Douglas Core area, which I showed, is just an example of taking a smaller, finer scale, and that's just a couple master's projects that we're going to incorporate. I'd be much more than happy to take input from others. I know Brian Mueller is going to be talking about some of their cheatgrass efforts and weed spraying, but it'd be nice in the future to have some of those efforts incorporated into the maps that we have. And I'm just going to conclude. I think standardizing our metrics, at least in the core area or sage-grouse habitat areas, will be very helpful. I will say, going back to that conceptual framework before, we set this up to be a best management practice database, meaning we're tracking the seed mixes. We really want to get the species specific. I think that would be huge if we actually went to the species specific level of monitoring, so we can figure out what seed mixes work for different soil types and different elevations and different slopes. For right now, we're going to take baby steps as long as we just have a column for richness. That's probably enough in the future. Actually getting what the actual forbs in that forb richness column are is going to be very helpful. Incorporating efforts from other industries and private landowners and individual projects will be continuously helpful. As a state, we're doing good. I do want to mention this is something that I'm kind of proud of. In the 1990s, when the Society of Ecological Restoration was formed, one of their top 5 problems with the field of ecological restoration is this lack of communication between academics, industry, and government. This is the largest project in the United States and I believe in the world where we're collaborating with the industry and with the government. So I think this is a great thing. I do think, as I pointed out, we need to strive to do better. And yeah, more than happy to take any input or any questions. If you have questions about the reclamation database, myself or Pete Stahl would be good contact for the MOM tool or the tool formerly known as MOM, EDCP. Debbie Ingraff, you can contact me too.
Michael, have you been able to identify in this where you have complete failure of reclamation, like where there's, BLM hasn't required an oil and gas operator to reclaim well sites?
One of the largest areas we have issues with is the Powder River Basin. A lot of that we have is in the pre-monitoring category where they're, I believe the Buffalo BLM in 2015 just put out an RFP or an ARFP. But yeah, prior to that, there's really no consistency on the operators out there, what they're collecting on the state. So that's
Well, I was thinking more than cases like where you get into oil and gas bankruptcy and then the BLM just stops. It doesn't require those companies to do anything.
I guess that'd be a question about bonding.
Well, I mean, if you can track reclamation if it's tried, but I'd be interested if you could see how many locations where nothing is happening because it's not even being attempted.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. All I know about in our database is when we are in the pre-monitoring stage. Beyond all that no data category is we've actually been able to map it on the ground. And when I'm saying no data, that doesn't mean data doesn't exist. It just means that operator or landowner hasn't provided us the data. So I can't really say if there's no data on the ground. That's just what that's what I'm saying. Is we don't have a house in our database.
So it would just come out as no data, not no reclamation.
Yeah, it's just we don't know if something's happening or if nothing's happening. We mapped it, but we don't know.
You don't have any idea why they increased the insects?
Yeah, so in the agriculture literature, I guess, yeah, pollinators and insects are a huge issue of global concern, but the last meta-analysis out of 22,137 studies, only 5 have been studied in non-crop systems. I think this will be the 7th study ever, the first one on gas. But it's consistent with all the literature is that if there's no forbs in understory or lack of forbs, in agriculture they'll call it mass crop flowering. I would consider that basically the same thing, really, where the forb resources are on this island. We won't have forbs. It makes sense that that's their source of nectar and food where they would be attracted to. Right, and that's something I think when I'm talking about where we overlook the processes sometimes. Our reference community is definitely sagebrush with very little understory. I do think we can have higher ecosystem function, at least in terms of pollination and biodiversity on these sites where we're intentionally increasing forage. That just makes sense with all the literature. That's the food source that they have. That's one of the things I'm looking at is if they're moving from pad to pad, are they actually having benefits? A little bit of forest understory offsite would think that they would.
How long do you think the plants will last?
It's an annual. It's something that a specific operator up in that area does a lot of it in the first year. And it will come back for the next couple of years. It doesn't seem to really all that long. His logic behind it, as far as I can tell, is uses that one to stabilize the soil and two almost as a snow fence. They'll go in and broadcast you a lot of times in between those be nice because shrubs and grasses out here. But yeah, it does seem to persist for some years.
How many years do you think it will take in what you're seeing to reach staging 4? In the state of the Wamsutter or Jonah here?
From a site, from scratch or from the well field?
You get even right.
Yeah, that's going to depend a lot on the climate. It's going to depend a lot on the sequences. Certain contracting companies are going out to grass and shrub heavy early. So getting the works and errors and they quite a long time. They might not know. Yeah, I would say anywhere from 7 years plus to get the city brush unless we use that.
Right.
What are the biggest holdbacks as far as the on-the-ground application? What are the biggest issues going forward as you see them?
On the ground issues for reclamation. One of the issues that I have is there's an inconsistency in monitoring. That can be timing and it can be also technique. So if I go through my data system, and I totally agree with Bob that we should look at trends over time, that's just 1 year. But I'll see these kind of ups and downs, and when I look at it, sometimes it just doesn't make sense to me, and then I'll actually go deeper into the data and figure out, well, shoot, they monitored in August this year, of course we're not going to see forms. Or they went from a dot and wire method 1 year to a line translation the next year. It's really hard to correlate them. So I think getting a monitoring standard would be helpful. The second thing, in a lot of these fields, operators have over 1,000 well paths. It's taking maybe from Memorial Day to Labor Day to monitor all of them. That's something that I think is a real risk of a false negative if you're monitoring for forbs on August 15th. Your forb column is probably going to say 0. Can you be confident that you failed on forbs that year? I don't think so. You're just not monitoring it. So yeah, I think, and that's going back to project management. It's monitoring is something that people often overlook or want to try to budget back for, but I would argue if you can't measure it, you can't really adapt to it or make a decision based on it. So that's something that is going to be the bulk of my PhD research.
So are you going to be able to move toward uniform approach?
I'll be,
recommendation?
yeah, I'm going to be up in Buffalo next week working with the Buffalo field office, and I've been in contact with Gordon Hobbs, the national director of the AIM program. We're working with multiple people in the field. That's something we're going to try to do this summer. Hopefully multiple operators in multiple fields. It's just going down a group of people trying out different methods, figuring out how to increase their statistical power and hopefully reduce the time.
And is seat availability ready or is it still a challenge?
It depends. We published a paper in December of Rangelands about forbs for sage grouse. In terms of the native seed network, we're lacking on native forbs that are available for the specific sage grouse diet. And I know that that's something that's being, I think, pretty actively worked, or is being worked on pretty actively.
Jan's got a question.
Based on what you said about the sampling time, the data that you're getting, the process work from everybody for your project, are you going to have a mechanism that you can sort your data, say if somebody shooting for data that's collected in August, or certain regions that you'll be able to take up out of your data set for your analysis?
Yeah, so the way I'm approaching that now, I'm working with the Rocky Mountain Herbarium database. And with that, at least in terms of forbs, they break down into 4 criteria. If it's not flowering, if it's flowering, if it's flowering and setting seed, or if it's seed set. And we're going to try to use a moving window approach to sort of figure out how this is moving across the state to figure out this is what we should be monitoring. This field for forbs, this is what we should be monitoring this field for forbs. And using that, I can go in and say, this is data based on what we're seeing from the no data from under area monitored outside of the window that we expect to see those specific Yes. Right, and that's something that we would expect it to stay pretty consistent in the order of how it's changing. Mindell probably always going to bring up later at Momsetter, but yeah, Momsetter some years might be late April, some years it might be early to mid-June. So yeah, that's another challenge with the climate that we have. That's not just with temperature, it's with moisture as well.
Okay, a couple more. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
You ready, Brian?
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Wheeler. I'm with the University of Wyoming, now based out of the Sheridan Research and Extension Center. See a lot of friendly faces in the audience. Some of you guys have heard quite a bit of this. Thanks to Mary for the invite, and I guess to Slade and Ian for kind of volunteering me to talk about some of the cheatgrass stuff that's going on in Wyoming. So I would consider myself sort of a reluctant cheatgrass researcher, but I've probably worked more on cheatgrass for the past 10 years than I have on anything else. And so we've been able to accumulate a little bit of knowledge about sort of the status in Wyoming and a few other ways, or a few other things that we need to consider, I think. And so my approach for the next little bit, I'll try to keep it within about a half hour and leave plenty of time for questions. Well, last time I talked about this, I think I talked for 3 hours straight. So interrupt me if there's something specific you want to talk about at that time. Please interrupt me. We can chat about it. We don't have to wait until the very end. So I'll talk a little bit about some things we've already done and a couple of current ongoing projects that sort of tie into some discussions we've had at the larger sort of stage level. So we've done a lot of just straight herbicide trials, and this is sort of traditional weed science. I can't see the slide, so I'm going to wander around. If that doesn't bother you guys, it's in your names. I'm sorry. So we've done a lot of trials like this. This is actually just north of Casper, where you see the brown color here. This is a high level of cheatgrass. The green color here, a lot of people think that probably some other annual weed that came back after we removed the cheatgrass on this site. We actually released pretty good blue grama, needle and thread, and a few other perennial grasses. And this is relatively easy to do. I like to tell most of my management workshops that cheatgrass it's easy to kill, but it's really hard to get rid of. And so this kind of thing with various different herbicides is something that we can be pretty consistent. It's just when you're trying to do this over hundreds of thousands of acres over repeated years, how you actually make that work from a meaningful standpoint. And I'll touch on that a little bit more. I wanted to talk a little bit about that in terms of a larger picture. So a group of us, researchers from UW, Utah State, Montana State, and Colorado State recently submitted a meta-analysis of basically all the published literature that we could find in the United States related to cheatgrass management. And so the points on the map are 140 plus papers that represent over 200 individual studies. We took the data from all of those and sort of lumped them together and reanalyzed those to see if there were any reliable trends that showed up basically across the range of where cheatgrass is based. And so I'll just point out a few of sort of the take-home messages, just a way to interpret these graphs right quick. So the filled circles are short term, and you can see an open circle here that's long term. There's not a whole lot of true long-term literature related to cheatgrass control. So short-term, we're considering 1 year after application. Long-term, anything 2+ years. And typically, the longest that we had was out to 4 or 5 years. So if the point and the standard error of the confidence intervals do not overlap 0, then that means that it's different from if nothing were done. So it's different than the control. So I pointed at herbicide here just to show that across all of those different studies, look at short-term herbicide decreased downy barometer cheatgrass seed density, and over the long term also decreased cheatgrass seed density. Now, why is seed density especially important for something like cheatgrass? It's an annual plant, so its entire life cycle revolves around producing seeds. It does not come back from the roots, so if we can ever reduce or prevent seed setting, then we'll start making some progress with an annual weed maintenance. So herbicide is actually the only consistent thing that we show through all those different studies that reduced seed density both in the short term and the long term. Burning actually led to an increase in seed density once you get to 2 years after the burn. We know that pretty consistently with a species like cheatgrass is facilitated and made work by fire. I'm going to zoom in more Wyoming specific stuff here in a few minutes. So, if we look at just cheatgrass abundance, so this was either cover, biomass, or actual plant density, we see a relatively similar pattern. So of the treatments, burn, defoliate, which is either mowing or grazing, herbicide, revegetation, soil disturbance, soil amendment, or woody plant removal. And this one, things look a little bit different. Revegetation and herbicide were the only two to consistently, across many different sites, to reduce cheatgrass abundance, both in the short term and the long term. Now, one caveat with revegetation. This was not just going out and seeding some other grasses into a cheatgrass patch. Revegetation was typically done in coordination with a herbicide application. Right? So that's one of the things that we know pretty well. I mean, has anyone ever worked on a project where you try to reseed native perennial species into high density cheatgrass stand without any other kind of control? Anybody want to talk about your success or something like that? If you can do it, you're much better than I am. And establishing those natives, and that's pretty consistent across the board. But so what this points out is we have a lot of tools. There's only a few that consistently work across a large scale. In spite of the fact that maybe we don't want to use herbicide as much as we do, but there's probably a good reason that we do. And that's pretty consistent. Any questions before we move on to some more specific stuff? Okay, you can hold it to the end if you don't. So I can't really talk about cheatgrass without talking about the sort of the context of the system. And I visualize things in terms of the sort of standard practice in range science these days. We talk about states, steady states, transition between those states. So as an example with cheatgrass, if we move from left to right across these pictures, and I'll talk on this side of the room for a minute, we move from basically zero cheatgrass to cheatgrass free, all the way up to cheatgrass dominated, where pretty much that's all that's there. And when I'm thinking about how to make recommendations to landowners, I also think about not just how much cheatgrass there is, but what kind of recovery potential there is in that site. So are there still desirable, perennial, hopefully native species that are able to recover if we can remove the competition from cheatgrass? And often that's the case. In fact, there's sometimes where I would go to a site that I thought looked like this. If you dig down beneath the cheatgrass canopy, there are persistent perennial plants that are there. They're just so suppressed that you can't tell that they're there when you drive by. So at some low level of cheatgrass infestation, we know that the native plants are still sort of driving the way that system works. Now, when it comes to the point of whether there's increased continual disturbance, whether it's sort of mismanaged grazing, whether it's repeated fires, whether it's long-term drought, something that pushes that over an ecological threshold where now cheatgrass is driving the way the system works instead of the native grasses, it becomes much more difficult to move it back to a more desired state. So this is the way that I kind of frame up management decisions. Depending on where we are along this curve, it might dictate what sort of approach we take. So if we're way down here, we're going to think about maintenance and prevention of cheatgrass from being established. Yeah, if we're working with our friends in the Great Basin, there's not a lot of cheatgrass-free areas there that are susceptible that they have to work with. We still have places that are susceptible to cheatgrass that don't have one in the state. I'll touch on that a little bit more. So that's definitely a high leverage point if we can get there. The other high leverage point to me is if we think we're going to cross over that threshold where cheatgrass starts driving the way that system works, we can implement some kind of active management at that stage. Do I see a big problem with that?
What's that? You do it wrong. Well, you do it wrong, but also, I don't know where that is. So identifying an ecological threshold is a pretty challenging thing to do. Usually we don't know if we've crossed the threshold until after we've crossed the threshold. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current project that we have that we're trying to figure out how we can do that. So Mike was talking about seed availability. And this is a young man, Will Rose, who's now a state land, did a really cool master's project, in my opinion, looking at cheatgrass as a seed contaminant in reclamation seed. So this picture, you can see this is blue bunch wheatgrass seed, a little bit greener, a little bit tan. This is cheatgrass seed, the redder one with an awn. Pretty similar shape, pretty similar size. Really difficult to separate out of that blue bunch wheatgrass seed with physical means. Right? You can't really sieve it out, you can't float it out. And in coordination with BLM, I think it was a 2013, somebody else can correct me on this number if you want to, 2013 seed purchase. They purchased about 1.5 million pounds of seed for reclamation in the western U.S. A lot of that would have been post-fire reclamation. Some of that would have been seed going into cheatgrass-free areas. Of that 1.5 million pounds of seed, there were 45 million cheatgrass seeds included as contaminants. So we have to swallow the fact that even if we're trying to plant perennial species to prevent cheatgrass from becoming established on the site, we're accidentally planting cheatgrass in many cases. It's not, you cannot completely prohibit it in seed. I don't think anyway. It's not a state designated noxious weed. So I think we're allowed up to 1,200 seeds per pound of cheatgrass in any of our seed, even certified seed staying around. So Will thought we might be able to look at a different way to separate it out. And one of the things we know about cheatgrass is it germinates at really low temperatures. So right around 0. So a little bit 3C, a little bit above freezing, we look at 6C and 12C, looking at sort of a range of temperatures to see if we can get cheatgrass to germinate. At the same time, so we had 3 different collections of cheatgrass down in Rome. We had 3 different native species that represent kind of a range of different growth types. And we subjected them to cold temperatures and water, basically to see what the germination would look like. What we found is that all of these bumps here really early, even at these colder temperatures, was percent germination of cheatgrass in those 3 different populations. So if we look at this is a relatively cool temperature. We see after about 10 days, roughly 90 to 100% cheatgrass germination, and then almost no germination from our perennial grass. Right? That's what we wanted to see. Our thought was we can expose it to water, germinate off the cheatgrass, and then dry everything down to the point that the cheatgrass seedlings would die and the natives would still retain their viability. Then we can use that as cheatgrass-free seed. Pretty simple idea. This part worked. The next part maybe didn't work that well. So we did that. We put them through the germination treatment. We laid them out on a lab bench in Laramie in August. Just open, expose the air, pretty dry air. Everything dried up pretty crispy. And so then we put them back into conditions that would have been ideal for each of the individual species here. So with our check, so we had relatively low germination of some of our natives, but we also, so this is if we did nothing to it and we just put it back into the growth chamber. These are our early sort of pre-treatments where we try to get the cheatgrass to germinate. If we didn't do anything, you can see the kind of germination percent that we got for our cheatgrass populations. And then as we move into our treatments, they almost all die, right? So after we did our treatment, we had 0 viable cheatgrass seeds in the 6 degrees Celsius. So that worked. The scary thing about this is we had almost 100% germination in our early treatment with this. We put them out, let them dry out, put them back in water, and like 10% of those cheatgrass essentially came back to life after completely drying out. So blue bunch wheatgrass in western, we also reduced germination by our treatment process, which is not what we wanted to do, right? We wanted to
kill the cheatgrass and then retain sort of optimum germination that we can give to the natives. Blue grama, they kind of held pretty steady at some of the lower temperature treatments. So this was a small subset of this project, and then we're going to continue working on this to see if there are other combinations of things that we can do. Because it seems like something that we should be able to do to prevent the continual sort of reintroduction of cheatgrass into some of these areas, or introduction into some areas where we don't already have. And if we can work out a process, we might work on this for other species. The question is going to be ramping this up to a large scale. I don't know if we have to have like an industrial malting sort of facility set up. We can figure out the numbers. But how do we do? Okay, there's no way to do 1.5 million pounds of seed and make this realistic. So the other thing I did want to touch on right quick is it seems like we always want to think that we can graze cheatgrass and use it as a primary management tool. It is a decent forage early in the spring. After it starts to turn purple and tan, and really the forage quality diminishes pretty significantly. And animals just typically don't eat it that much unless there's nothing else there. So Kara Doseworthy, a student of mine, worked on a targeted grazing project at one of our sites over by Torrington, where we had sheep, cows, and then we had both sheep and cow grazing the same plots. They grazed in spring, they grazed in fall, they grazed in both fall and spring. We were trying to see if there was a difference between animal species, a difference between timing, and how they would affect cheatgrass population dynamics. And because we're fair and we want to see how it compares to standards, we also put in a couple of herbicides that people use instead of just saying, yeah, look how well grazing works unless we compare it to the standard. That's one of the limitations of many targeted grazing studies. So this gives you an idea. This was an early spring treatment. This would be grazed next fall. Pretty cheatgrassy site, pretty bad. We got a little corner, yeah, it's hard to see anyway. So we're looking at about 90% utilization, right? This is beyond any utilization level that, as a range scientist, I would probably ever be comfortable recommending to someone on a repeated basis. And especially after this study, we thought we were more on that line. So we did that for 2 years. Spring, fall, spring, fall. The first thing that I'll point out is that we didn't break it out by species because it didn't matter if it was sheep, it didn't matter if it was cows, it didn't matter if it was both sheep and cow. We got the same results in this study. That's the one study. This is cheatgrass biomass. So how much cheatgrass is there on the site? So if we did nothing, we're roughly up around 2,000 pounds per acre conversion. If we did fall grazing, it basically acted like we didn't do anything to it. So it kept grazing just as well. I'm going to touch on that one a little bit more in just a second. So any of the grazing treatments that included spring grazing reduced cheatgrass biomass by roughly 2/3 after 2 years. Rimsulfuron, which is sold as matrix, and imazapic, which is sold as plateau, did reduce cheatgrass biomass. But this is kind of strange for us. But I've actually had a few plateau failures on this site. There's something weird with soils that I had not figured out. It's usually a very consistent product. If we look at cover, this is in the fall, so this would be after moisture, because cheatgrass typically germinates in the fall. We see a pretty similar pattern. But the thing that really I want to point out, well, after I get through this, I'll come back to that. Is this. We're talking about seed production. And this is kind of my redneck bar graph. So each one of these jars, budget cuts, Bob. I can afford the jars. Don't keep those by the still. Yeah, people have ruined beer for cheatgrass. So each jar has seeds, number of seeds per meter squared, right? So the first thing to think of is, Kara and some poor undergraduates, and I've counted a few days, had to clean and count all these darn seeds so that we knew how much was there and get all this stuff out of the way, right? So that was terrible. But if we did nothing, we're like at 2 quarts, right? Just for comparison. 2 quarts. Now, to translate that, 2 quarts in this study was 200 pounds of cheatgrass seed per acre. Okay, we're talking about seeding. What kind of native seeding rates do we seed? Anybody? 8, 10, 12, 15 pounds, right? So that might be something like this. Okay. What's up with fall grading? Although it wasn't statistically significant, there was an apparent increase in seed production if you only graze it in fall. Does that surprise anybody? If you think about some of the folks that graze winter wheat in the southern Great Plains through the winter, one of the benefits that they see from that is increased tillage. And they sometimes see increased wheat production as far as from a grain standpoint. So we may, if we only do fall grazing on heavy cheatgrass areas, we may be making the seed problem potentially worse. I'm not going to jump up and down and say that because this was one site and one study, but I think it's something that we need to keep in mind. So our spring and fall grazing, we reduced it by roughly half, so we're down to 100 pounds of seed per acre. Rimsulfuron, we had negligible seed per acre, even 2 years after application. And I would typically expect that from the Magic application, but as I said on this one, that was a failure on this site.
Why was that?
I don't know.
Bad chemical?
No, it was not. We've had a couple failures on this site. I think there's a soil issue
With the method.
with the Magic on this particular site. I think, so it's heavier clay soils, and there's some kind of weird salinity issue.
But you did test the herbicide. It was.
It's the same model that I had used elsewhere that was perfect. It was not a chemical failure, it was a site. So I want to go back to this. So take home message in some ways, this was an incredibly degraded pasture. There was not, remember our continuum that we talked about earlier, there was not a lot of recovery potential. So when Kara reported her results, she could easily say, we had no negative impact with this heavy grazing on perennial grasses. That's because there were only like 5 perennial grasses in the whole pasture, right? So we couldn't have had a serious impact on perennial grasses. And the interesting thing with this, to show you how degraded of a site it was, when we got some cheatgrass control, all we did was release a whole bunch of annual kochia. Right? So you trade one thing for another, and in terms of spring grazing, I'd probably rather graze cheatgrass than I would kochia. So knowing sort of what that site could potentially do is something to always recommend and keep. And while I've got this up here, it makes me think, if you're interested in cheatgrass, if you're interested in a little friendly competition, this is the site of where some of you guys know about our Wyoming Restoration Challenge is occurring. We've got 13 teams from around the state. Game Fish has a team, UW has a couple teams that are trying to restore this site back to a diverse sort of productive range. And whoever does it the best wins the prize. Mostly just bragging rights. But you can follow if you do. You search Wyoming Restoration Challenge on Facebook. They're putting updates and stuff on there. You can see what all the different teams are doing. There were a few teams that were looking pretty good last fall, going into the fall, and then we got around to this spring and cheatgrass started growing. It looks like they didn't even do anything. So it's definitely an interesting little project. So I'm going to have to come back and actually use maps for this. So I wanted to expand the scope out a little bit. Is that okay if I come back and bother you? So you guys know the state of Wyoming pretty well. Oh, it's okay. I can stay. I'll probably continue to go back and forth a little bit. Thank you. So this is a little video that I put together to kind of talk a little bit about some of our projects, and I'm going to want to start it and finish it. So Kara, the young lady that worked on the grazing project, she didn't have enough to do, and so we also had her working on, if it'll come up here, on assessing the distribution of cheatgrass. Oh, come on. Across the state of Wyoming, and it's going to end up not working on this computer. It's supposed to be a really beautiful distribution map that pops up. Well, I guess we're going to just talk about a map of Wyoming. That was working on my computer. So Kara and her team gathered, thanks to some of you guys, existing cheatgrass data, presence, absence, and then abundance data. Yeah, if you want to just click around, if you can get the video to start playing, that would be good. I don't think it's going to. And then we also surveyed, we sent out survey crews and surveyed additional points throughout the state for a couple of years. In total, we ended up with somewhere around 18,000 data points spread across the state of Wyoming for either cheatgrass presence, absence, or cheatgrass abundance. I'm really sorry, I should have had it set aside. The short story, and I'll paint a visual picture. Great question. So if we look at locations that have greater than 50% chance of cheatgrass establishing or cheatgrass presence, it's pretty much the whole state. Okay, anything below 10,000 feet. If we look at areas that have a high probability of cheatgrass becoming dominant, which we were calling the impact niche. So cheatgrass covered greater than 50% on a particular site. Then it starts to get narrowed down a little bit more. And does anybody want to guess where those areas are? You guys are familiar with the state, right? Those are big geographic areas, so don't tell me like Coral Creek or something. Bighorn Basin. So Bighorn Basin definitely pops out one of our major areas. High probability of establishment, high probability of impact economics. Surprisingly, pretty much everything about from I-25 up this way shows up in pretty darn high probability of establishment, and also pretty darn high probability of impact. Now, one of the things that is significantly a departure from sort of the past scientific perspective of cheatgrass, in that it was a big sagebrush grassland invader. It was not a northern Great Plains type invasive problem, and that's one of the things that Sarah's data showed really effectively. How much time do we have? How much time have I got?
About 5 minutes.
All right. Well, I was going to get my computer.
You can't do a full 50-minute lecture.
No. Well, what time did we get started?
I think it was 9:30.
Start till 11 o'clock. I'm just getting started.
I know, that's why I said 5 minutes. I'll give you 6.
So that was a significant departure from what people had thought in school. In fact, Dennis Knight, who wrote the book on vegetation ecology, changed the story quite a bit in the updated version of Mountains and Plains to reflect the new distribution of cheatgrass in the state of Wyoming. It's not that Dennis was wrong in the first version, it's just the story has changed. And I am pretty convinced that drought in the early to mid 2000s, 2002 through 2008, depending on where you were, strongly contributed to that expansion and to the increase. A couple of the other places that pointed out is high probability of dominance for North Platte Valley, Saratoga and Camden's kind of headed down through that way, which is interesting because it's not currently a real high problem with cheatgrass, but the conditions based on what we extracted from the data points that we had showed that as a really important place. A lot of this sort of Star Valley country showed up as high probability of dominance. And then some of the areas kind of in along the front and the west side of the river. Different categories of those as far as where we are currently, how much cheatgrass there is now versus how much there could be. And so that concept of protecting those areas from cheatgrass invaders that have high susceptibility to dominance, but not a lot of cheatgrass now, is something that we've been talking about with game and fish, weed pests, state lands, and then Department of Ag, a few other people. I guess Fish and Wildlife Service is kind of now engaged in that discussion as well. And so because of that, we've got a new project that was also included in this video. We're focusing on 4 areas. So we've got a field site that we started in Saratoga last year, one outside Pinedale. I just left the site between Tinsley and Hyattville. Anybody ever been up through there? There's not any cheatgrass there. And then just outside Sheridan. So we've got 4 different areas that are all either highly susceptible or relatively highly susceptible to cheatgrass dominance in different stages of invasion. And at each of those sites, we are intensively mapping large blocks to be treated with a couple of different herbicides. And instead of, when I typically go out to select sites for most of my herbicide trials, I try to find really consistent weed densities across the entire site. I want it to look really homogeneous. Now I can get a good sort of gauge on what the different herbicides are doing. On this study, we're looking at larger blocks, aerial applications. And so within each block, to give you an idea of the number of data points that we're collecting, we did 100 acres yesterday with 1,400 data points within those 100 acres. So it's very intensive data collection that we can go back and track through time, because we're trying to get that range of variability instead of just focusing on 80% cheatgrass everywhere. We're trying to go from no cheatgrass to 100% cheatgrass. And then we can look and see how along that continuum it responds to treatment, right? In hopes that we can start to identify where that threshold is. So this is one of our sites in Saratoga. I'll show you a little bit. And so you can kind of see where the cheatgrass is. The type of data that we're collecting will be able to enable us to map the cheatgrass as far as real locations on 50-foot grids within each plot. So this site, you can kind of see a little break right here. The foreground here, see the foreground here we've been treated with plateau. The back portion here we've been left as a check. And then just over on this side, there's another 30-acre block that was treated last fall with a new herbicide. It's called Open Range G. It's actually a plateau taken and attached to sand grains. And so it's the same active ingredient that we worked with for years and years and years, but it's a different delivery method. And this is why we're kind of interested in this different delivery method. So when we apply with water as a carrier beneath the shrub canopy, oftentimes the shrub canopy or if there's a lot of other tall grass in the litter, it intercepts that herbicide and never makes it to either the target plant or the ground surface. So with cheatgrass, especially with plateau, we're typically considering pre-emergent application. So the cheatgrass is not up and growing yet, so we're trying to get the herbicide to the soil surface, right? So if it's hanging up in the shrubs, it never gets down where it needs to. With this open range, we think that we can potentially get better penetration through a shrub canopy and get better control even underneath those shrubs. And then you don't have these little islands of seeds that just continually put back in the system. So that's sort of the basic type question. This is the larger question. So the reason we're trying to do big plots is that we feel like there's a curve that exists where if you don't have enough cheatgrass, then your perennial grasses aren't being suppressed. And so doing some kind of treatment is not going to lead to any increase in perennial grasses or diversity or form production or something like that. As you start to get more and more cheatgrass, then your perennials start to be suppressed more. And so by removing that cheatgrass competition, we should realize some kind of concurrent increase in perennial grass production. Right? I mean, it's a pretty basic thought. We don't know where any of these curves exist. And at some point, you have so much cheatgrass that there's nothing to respond, and it just crashes. And then even if you get cheatgrass control, you get better ground unless you try to reseed. So there's points like this. At what point does it make sense for us to start implementing cheatgrass control? And at what point are we talking about a full-on respiration scenario? This is the project that we currently have going this summer. We should have some preliminary data by the end of the summer. So this would be really informative for instance, like NRCS does cost share on cheatgrass control. And right now they've got some numbers in there as far as how much cheatgrass do you need to get cost share, how much perennial grass do you need to have cost share. Those really are just absolute best guesses based on experience. They're not informed directly by any kind of quantitative data. So we hope to be able to generate this kind of information from this project.
How big an area is going to be treated?
For that project,
Well, just in any of your treated with herbicide.
well, so my operation is usually pretty small because it's all research.
I know there's some folks in here that have done about 35 on a yearly basis. And so you're going to have high variability across each site. Our plots are 30-acre plots, and that's our biggest ones for research sites. Dave, what's the biggest thing you got done?
Probably on any one given year, and you can get a lot of variability. It's just kind of an addition piece. And that issue with the supplemental sagebrush is really concerning. Just that an area we treated in 8 or 9, and you can see where the cheatgrass, or when you see where the sagebrush is, because that's where all the cheatgrass is. And it's standing up, it's actually cutting sun to the sagebrush, and we're starting to kill sagebrush underneath the cheatgrass cover because it's so thick. So some real nasty issues. Yeah.
So that's it. I didn't mention that. So we go back to that. That's the other kind of logic we have behind this. Unfortunately, but it's because it's what's been presented to us. Our typical cheatgrass management strategy within sagebrush ecosystems has been in response to fire. After the fire goes through, we've got emergency fire money so we can put a bunch of plateau out on the ground. The problem is in most big sagebrush stands, if that fire was severe enough, we've already lost the sagebrush. Right? So if we can prevent the fuel buildup before we lose the sagebrush in high quality sage grouse areas, then we don't have to figure out how to reset the sagebrush again. We can actually try to keep it. So we're kind of thinking about that from a proactive. Any other questions? I guess you're supposed to ask that, Bob. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Any other questions?
Are you done with it?
Yeah, that's
Okay, so
that's
questions, go ahead.
Yeah.
If you have,
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard it in my thing. How well mapped do you have all this stuff? And is this something that we can potentially build into the recognition tracking tool efforts database?
how well mapped do I have which stuff? So let's
Your
make-
cheatgrass control and how things are responding.
I can tell you exactly where I have everything.
Okay.
But then the turnabout, just to be fair, is how much cheatgrass data can you share with us to increase our monitoring? So it needs, because that would inform, we could improve our models as well. But there's no way to get complete coverage of the entire state. We are working with Google Earth and people on the Gale to try to do real-time cheatgrass mapping at state level. So we'll know more about that. I mean, we're able to share it anyhow.
Yeah, it should sit down sometime.
And I'm going to probably have more detailed treatment records and response than some of those recommendations.
What's your contact information?
Oh, I'm sorry. The easiest way to get in touch with me is probably by email. That's BAMEALOR@uwyo.edu.
Other questions?
So I feel like I'll let the air out of the room.
So actually, I do have one, because this is all focused on herbicides now. We're doing more right now with biological, and here's something where you're at with that, where you see that going. My board yesterday funded, after a dozen of those? On cheatgrass, we did 6 up here, we did, so they're all testing, looking at the biological or the biological in combination with herbicide. Where are we with that?
So specifically the bacteria. So where are we with it? My stance right now is it's an unproven technology, and so I'm glad that you guys are getting some out on the ground so we can see what it does. I'm skeptical by nature, and it's kind of my job to be skeptical. If this were a new synthetic herbicide that we were talking about, everybody would be jumping on the bandwagon so quickly. They would be wanting to see data first. Right, so just to be fair, I'll say that. I've got a small test plot with and without plateau outside of Sheridan too. I'm really interested in it. I really hope it does what some of the people that are pushing it says that it does. But at this point, Bob, I have not seen any real data at all that show that it doesn't.
Are you doing anything on it?
I've got some test plots and that's it. It's the access is somewhat controlled. Any of the real dramatic, like 1 year after success stories that I've seen, it's always been applied with herbicide. And Ann will say that it takes 3 to 4 to 5 years to begin to see the impacts of the bacteria. Like I said, I hope it works, but right now I'm not going to recommend it to anybody until I know more.
So I'll get with you. We've got a bunch more sites. If you want to do them.
And I do know, so I'm working with BLM, with Wheatley, BLM out of Denver and DC. They put out, I think, 10 or 11 different relatively large scale plots throughout the West and really help them analyze the data.
One of the problems with that is that most of those plots are in Idaho and they're not.
We had 3 in
Did you end up with 3? Okay. So
We
we
have
have some more.
I think they all went out. So we will have some Wyoming.
I'll get with you.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of sites and I think it'd be good if we could, because we do need numbers.
We
So
do.
that is,
The tough part about it is we don't know anything until 3 or 4 years. If it really takes 3 or 4 years, I mean, dang, university research, we take forever to get it out anyway, right? It's kind of tough, mostly a joke. But so that's kind of where I am. I've been watching to see.
yeah, so we've got some stuff, but it depends on ice, but we're on in the second year of work on some of our plots. So we will have, we'll have data soon. It's not there yet. We are seeing what looks like some kind of indication that we may have some success. Right. But it's still not there. Well, I think that's universal, but I think it's wise to be skeptical, but I think it's also important that we test this in different soil types, in different elevations, in different aspects. And that's what primarily Game and Fish is doing a great job of getting out and doing this. And I think we need to make sure we integrate all of these efforts so we're all talking to each other.
I agree. And that would be something that we could try to coordinate somehow and share that data.
Okay, Ian, do you have something?
Sure, I do. Just real quick, at the last decision meeting in Lander, you asked us to compile some of that data on biological control. And to be quite honest, we have a database set up that's ready to go, but really there's not a lot of data to populate it with just yet. And so we'll plug in the projects that we're going to do this fall. That'll go in there, and then working with Brian and others, we'll go ahead and add that stuff as well. We are getting some pushback, so on a lot of this is being applied on private land, and so certainly folks are concerned about that as an issue, and so we're trying to work through that. And really, the end goal of all of this data collection is, like you said, to determine how effective it is. So I think that although we don't have a lot to report at the current time, 5 years from now, by collecting that data starting now, we should have a lot better handle on it.
The other two issues that I'm aware of, proximity to water has been an issue, probably an overstated issue. I think we're getting to the point where that's starting to back off, but aerial application on the forest is the other one, Dennis. And we're having hell in Region 4. What? Aerial application on forest lands, we're still fighting that in Region 4. You guys are doing it. But so those are just some things we need to keep an eye on this as we move forward.
And that's not specific to the bacteria, that's any area.
I don't know.
It isn't kind of nuanced, just going out with the whole bacteria thing. There's P7, there's ACK55. P7 is registered by the EPA, ACK55 is in the midst of registration as biopesticide. And then there's the weird NB906, which is being sold as a soil quality amendment, which means that they cannot claim any kind of phytotoxic activity at all or it has to be registered as a pesticide. And so people need to be sure that whoever they're talking to, that they're fully within the labels and are not sort of getting themselves in trouble.
But it's all the same stuff. Yeah. All right, go ahead.
Oh, this is me.
Don't fly.
Are there any restrictions as far as applying the biological treatments on federal lands by any method? Obviously, there is with the Forest Service in certain areas, but BLM?
Everybody, you know, you want to talk about that?
You know, we go through our NEPA process for something like that, like to look at the implications, and then, you know, just try to use the best science that's out there to you know, base our decision process. You know, we're like everybody else, we've got tons and tons of cheatgrass, and we're looking for an answer. Because it's a huge management issue, not only with grazing, but with the energy. Does that help?
So if it's not currently on your approved list, approved by EPA, you've got acreage restrictions for test lots. 10 acres per se per year, something like that. That's some kind of weird acreage.
And I think they expanded